Hey everybody, Mr. Barnett again. Let's go ahead and get into the next topic, which is the economy of the West. The West, basically, at this point in the 1700s, we considered the West anything that was past the Appalachians. So if you'd passed over that mountain range, you were beyond it. So the Ohio River Valley, Mississippi River, the Northwest Territories, those were all what we considered the West at this point. More and more people started moving west, and so that definition changed over time. So as it was almost kind of like, remember when we talked about wilderness, how that definition changes? The term the West changed as well as people moved further and further west. By about the 1800s, the West was basically west of the Mississippi. So this basically, you can see this red line here in the middle, that's the Mississippi River. At first, in the 1700s, this all would have been west, right? So this whole area would have been classified as west in the 1700s. But at about the 1800s, it switched to where all of this now is the west. Today, now, the west is actually just mostly here. This area is called the Midwest. And then the west is like Colorado over by most definitions. So that's kind of changed over time. But about in 1800, there were about 50,000 people that lived between the Appalachians and the Mississippi. Matter of fact, they didn't even count the people, so we're not even 100% sure if it was 50,000. They just kind of didn't care after that, especially west of the Mississippi. They didn't even have a number for that. The ones in between there, we're kind of sure that was 50,000. But beyond the Mississippi, it was just like, there's people there. There's a few. By about 1850, though, 500,000 people lived between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, and then 200,000 west of the Mississippi, which is quite a few. In today's numbers, those numbers are still pretty small, but for the time, those were very, very large numbers. The big thing that drew people out west was actually cheap farmland and railroads. So the railroads, as they moved west, they actually created jobs, not only just because people had to build the railroads and man the railroads, but also because the fact that railroads were there created more jobs, especially in like mining or lumber or other industries, even things like, owning a business somewhere. There was more and more of those types of jobs needed. It also made farming more accessible elsewhere. So you could have more access to markets, even if you were out in the middle of nowhere because of the railroads. Here's a pretty cool old picture of building the railroads. You notice over here, there's telegraph lines as well. So they could communicate along the line. So it was kind of they did both of these at the same time. So the telegraph would go at the same rate as the railroad. They usually had the telegraph poles. They were easier to create. And so the telegraph was usually a few miles ahead of the railroad. All right, so the main natural resource of the West is actually farmland. Sometimes we think of farms and not farmland. So the farmland is the natural resource. Farms are not natural. They are human-made, right? But the farmland itself, the land that is viable to have a farm on, that you could actually build a farm on, that's a natural resource. There was actually a lot of good farmland. So basically, most farmers didn't really worry about preserving their soil. They would tap out the minerals in the soil. They would just plant as much as they could and then just move further west when it became depleted. Not a very environmentally safe way to do it anymore, but there's also a lot of other resources, gold, silver in certain places, but lumber in a lot of places, iron, things like that. All right, so in terms of equipment and tools, huge inventions that helped the West were the steel plow and the mechanical reaper. Now, if you don't know what these are, that's okay. You probably know what the steel plow is, but maybe not the reaper. The steel plow was actually invented in 1837 by a guy named John Deere. Yes, he was a real dude. He's not just a green hat. He created this steel plow that was basically a lot more rugged. It was tough. It could get through a lot more stuff. Remember, I told you that the Great Plains, most settlers at first just skipped over them because they were not farmable. The problem was that there were so many roots already there from grasses in the plains, you couldn't plow them up with an iron plow. Your plow would just break. So with the steel plow, John Deere invented this, and that actually was strong enough to break up the Great Plains and make it so you could actually farm there. So this is a huge improvement for a lot of the West. it basically opens up a huge amount of land for farming. So this is what that first one looked like. It doesn't look like much. Now you see John Deere's are a little different than that, but that was one of the first things that John Deere made. All right, and then the mechanical reaper was invented in 1833 by a guy named McCormick. Basically, reaping was a process where you generally had teams of people. You would have a scythe. You probably have seen them before, but you don't know what they're for. That's what the Grim Reaper carries, right? A scythe basically was a blade that you would swing at ground level and cut the stalks of wheat. Somebody else would then gather those up into bundles and then carry that off to be to have the actual wheat grains taken off of it, which is kind of a long time consuming process. It takes teams of people to clear a field. But with the mechanical reaper, this machine would actually do all of it for you. Basically, you'd pull it behind a horse. You'd need one guy to direct the horse and kind of maintain the machinery, but one person could do what whole teams of people had to do before. So these guys are all thinking, man, somebody should make this automated. And guess what? Here it comes. So this one is kind of a more advanced one. This required a couple of people, but it did a lot more. So this would actually bundle it up right for you. Later, they actually created things that would actually take off all the grains of wheat for you. And that's kind of what we have now, right? You see these big, huge tractors that just dump out grain and they're done. Which is pretty crazy. Transportation was a big problem in the 1800s. The problem is that there's not any rivers that go east to west for at least that are reliable and go to large areas where there's a lot of farming available. Some rivers go east to west for some of the time, but you can't travel the country on rivers. There's a lot of mountains in the way. There's not that many cities, so there's a bunch of problems. Steamboats did help on some of the rivers. Basically, if you could get your products, whatever that was, to the Mississippi River, whether that was through the Missouri River or somewhere else, if you could get to the Mississippi River, you could transport it pretty easily. But other than that, it was still really, really difficult. The railroads will make that easier later. They're just starting at this point. One problem that a lot of farmers had out west was that they needed a lot of credit. They needed to buy land, but they also needed to hire workers. They needed equipment. They needed to build buildings on their property to protect their grains and things like that. All of this stuff cost money, and they didn't really have any money at first because the way farming works is you invest a bunch of money, but you don't actually make any money for 6 or 8 months, right? So you have to have money up front to do this. So farmers had a hard time with this. A lot of the Western banks, or excuse me, a lot of the Eastern banks wouldn't trust Western farmers because they didn't understand farming. They didn't think it was going to be profitable. So a lot of people actually in the West started creating their own banks. If somebody was successful with farming and they made some money, they would then loan that to somebody else and get interest back from it. So they made a little bit more money off of that money, right? And they'd help somebody else start farming. So they kind of set up their own banking in a lot of places, actually. Kind of cool. There was a ton of demand for food that was grown in the West. There were a lot of populations that were growing in Europe, and they were actually tapping out their farming. They couldn't feed themselves. Same with the Northeast, right? The population's growing there. Remember, we had a bunch of immigrants coming in. And so if you could grow food in the West, you had somebody who would buy it. There was plenty of demand for food. And because we were able to produce so much more with all the equipment that was created during this time, these Western farmers were actually able to meet that demand and be able to feed large portions of the world. We actually, as a country, still export more food than we import. So we produce more food than we need, and that's with only a few farmers now. So in the West, farms were a lot more profitable than other industries. So it was a good way to make money. However, there's some problems with farming because the prices fluctuate so much. So one year you might do really, really well, but then the next year your whatever you produce might not be worth as much as last year. And so it's kind of variable. It fluctuates quite a bit, which can be a little scary. So a lot of times these farmers in the West started to actually specializing in certain crops because then they could just buy one type of equipment that they would need. They just keep the seeds from the prior year. They are able to figure out what time is best to plant these crops, and really figure out that one thing. And they were actually able to yield more of that crop and make more money because of specialization. You'll notice now, most of the time in our big farms now, most farmers only grow one or two things, um, and then they're able to just specialize in that one thing. All of their tractors are configured to grow that thing and work best with that thing. So, um, still around today for sure, that specialization. All right, that is it for the West. Make sure you do your homework, and tomorrow we will talk about the South. All right, thanks, guys. Have a fantastic rest of your day.